first snow found Ruth Calder before she had a roof. It came sideways across the Wyoming basin, thin as sand and sharp against her cheeks. Behind her stood the cabin where she had slept for 7 years. Ahead of her stood a gray limestone ridge with one black opening beneath its shoulder. Ruth carried one blanket, a tin coffee pot, a hatchet, and $32 sewn inside her coat. The men who had put her outside believed she would be back before dark. She did not turn around. 3 days earlier, her husband's older brother, Vernon Calder, had arrived with 2 wagons and a folded land claim in his pocket. Ruth's husband had been dead since spring, crushed beneath a rolling freight wagon near Casper. The claim had never been properly transferred into Ruth's name. Vernon knew it. By noon he had moved his family into the cabin. "You can stay until the weather clears," he had told her. Ruth looked through the window at Vernon's wife placing dishes inside Ruth's cupboard. "The weather is clear now." Vernon rubbed his jaw. "You know what I mean." Ruth folded her wool blanket. "Yes, I do." She left before anyone could decide to make kindness out of what they were doing. If there was one thing worth remembering about frontier winters, it was this. Cold rarely killed in a single dramatic moment. It worked by inches. Wet socks, a weak fire, a door that leaked, a woodpile cut too late. Ruth's father had taught her that before she was tall enough to lift his splitting maul. He had built stone cellars in Pennsylvania before bringing his family west. Whenever December came, he touched the thick cellar wall and told Ruth the same thing. Wood gives heat away fast. Earth keeps what it gets. She had not thought about those words for years. Now, they were all she had. The opening in the limestone ridge was not a deep cave. It was a broad, hollow cut beneath an overhang, perhaps 20 feet across and 12 feet deep. Ruth stepped inside. The wind stopped touching her face. That alone changed the calculation. She removed one glove and pressed her palm against the rear wall. The limestone was cold, but not like the air outside. It carried the slow, steady temperature of ground that had spent all summer storing warmth beyond the reach of the wind. Ruth crouched and studied the floor. Dry. Then the ceiling. No fresh watermarks. Then the opening. South-facing. By afternoon, winter sunlight would strike deep inside. She set down her blanket. "This will do." Her own voice sounded strange in the stone hollow. She spent the first day gathering dead cottonwood from the creek bottom. Every trip cost her nearly half an hour. She dragged branches uphill until the muscles in her shoulders began to jump beneath her coat. She did not burn them. Not yet. A person who burned wood before having a way to hold its heat was feeding the sky. Instead, Ruth used the last daylight to collect flat limestone. She stacked the stones across part of the cave mouth. One course, then another. The wall did not need to close the cave completely. It needed to break the wind and shrink the opening. By dusk, it stood barely knee-high. Ruth sat behind it and ate cold beans from a tin. Snow hissed across the exposed rock outside. The cabin chimney was visible far across the basin. Smoke rose from it in a thick, dark column. Vernon was burning plenty of wood. Ruth counted slowly. One wagon load might last his family a week if the temperature stayed mild. Less if the real cold came. She looked at her own pile. Then she looked at the stone around her. She had a different problem to solve. That night, she wrapped herself in the blanket and slept with her boots on. Near midnight, she woke, because something felt wrong. She sat up. The small fire she had finally allowed herself had gone out, yet her breath was not pouring white in front of her face. Ruth crawled toward the opening. The air beyond the low stone wall cut through her clothes at once. Inside, the difference could be felt against her skin. She returned to the rear wall and placed both hands against it. The rock had taken some warmth from the afternoon sun and the little fire. Not much, but it had kept it. Ruth remained there with her palms against the stone until her fingers warmed. Before sunrise, she was working again. She narrowed the entrance first. Then she dug a shallow drainage trench so melting snow could not run toward her sleeping place. By midday, blood had dried in 2 cracks across her knuckles. She wrapped them with strips torn from the bottom of her petticoat and continued stacking stone. The next problem was harder. Fire. An ordinary fireplace would send most of its heat straight upward. Ruth remembered her father complaining about that every winter. He had once shown her an old masonry heater built by a German bricklayer near Pittsburgh. The fire burned hard and fast inside. Smoke traveled through turns inside a thick body of brick before reaching the chimney. The bricks became warm. Hours later, after the flames were gone, the room stayed warm. Ruth stared at the limestone beside her. She had stone. She had clay along the creek, and she had time, though not much. On the fourth morning, she began building the base. She chose the flattest rocks and fitted them tightly. She mixed creek clay with dry grass and fine stone dust. Her first firebox collapsed before noon. Ruth looked at the broken stones for several seconds. Then she pulled them apart and started again. The second one held. Late that afternoon, a horse appeared on the trail below. Ruth heard the hoofbeats and reached for the hatchet. The rider stopped beneath the cave. He was a broad man near 50, wrapped in a buffalo coat. Snow clung to his hat brim. His eyes moved from Ruth to the stone wall, then to the clay-covered structure rising inside the cave. "You living in there?" Ruth kept the hatchet beside her leg. "I'm building in here." The man looked toward the northern sky. A dark bank of cloud had begun swallowing the mountains. "My name's Elias Boone. I keep cattle 6 miles east." Ruth said nothing. Elias pointed toward the clouds. "Army station got a wire this morning. Hard front crossed Montana yesterday." Ruth looked past him. The light had changed. The western snowfields were no longer bright. They had gone flat and gray. How long? Maybe 2 days. He studied her unfinished entrance. Maybe less. Ruth turned toward the half-built heater. The clay was still wet. Her woodpile was too small. Half the cave mouth was still open. Elias shifted in the saddle. "I've got an empty bunkhouse." Ruth picked up another stone. "Thank you. You coming?" She fitted the stone into the heater base and pressed clay around its edge. "No." Elias remained there another moment. Then he looked once more toward the advancing clouds. "All right." He turned his horse downhill. Ruth waited until the hoofbeats disappeared. Then she removed her coat, rolled up her sleeves, and reached for the next stone. Outside, the wind changed direction. The temperature began to fall. By sunrise, the sky had disappeared. Gray cloud pressed low over the basin, and fine snow moved across the ground in long white sheets. Ruth stood at the cave mouth with her coat buttoned to the throat and watched the northern ridge vanish. Elias Boone had been right. The storm was coming faster than she had planned. She turned back inside. The heater needed another full day before the clay joints could take a hard fire. Her entrance wall needed at least 3 more courses. The woodpile might last 4 days if she burned carefully. 4 days would not be enough if the front settled over the basin. Ruth took the hatchet and walked toward the creek. Every step into the wind cost twice what it had the day before. She worked close to the cottonwoods, cutting only dead branches dry enough to snap under the blade. Green wood would smoke. Wet wood would steal heat before giving any back. She tied the branches with rope and dragged them uphill. Then she went again. And again. By noon, ice had formed along the edge of her scarf. Her fingers no longer closed easily around the hatchet handle. Ruth returned to the cave and shoved the last bundle beneath the limestone overhang. The wind followed her only as far as the entrance. Inside, the air stood almost still. She checked the clay. Firm. Not ready, but closer. Ruth knelt beside the heater and opened the firebox with 2 fingers. The inner surface had dried lighter than the outer wall. She placed 3 thin sticks inside. 1 spark. A small flame climbed. Ruth watched the smoke. It moved through the first passage. Then slowed. A thin gray thread pushed back toward the firebox opening. Ruth immediately killed the flame with dirt. The draft was wrong. She sat back on her heels. Outside, the storm continued building. She could hear snow striking the stone wall like dry grain thrown against a barn door. The heater had to draw. Without that, smoke would fill the cave. Without the heater, she would be forced to burn an open fire and feed most of her heat into the canyon. Ruth crawled behind the stone mass and inspected the narrow channel she had built the night before. Her father's voice came back in pieces. Not words at first. Hands. The way he had held 2 fingers apart when explaining smoke passages. The way he had tapped the side of an old brick stove and told her that hot air moved where pressure allowed it to move. Ruth found the mistake. The second channel narrowed too sharply where 2 stones leaned inward. She stared at it. To fix it, she would have to remove nearly half the upper course. A full morning of work. Maybe more. She stood. The cave darkened suddenly. Ruth stepped outside. Snow had thickened until the creek below could barely be seen. She could no longer see the Calder cabin. For the first time since leaving it, that mattered. Not because she wanted to return. Because the cabin chimney had been her only distant marker. Now there was nothing outside but white. Ruth went back to the heater. She removed the first stone, then the second. She rebuilt the channel wider. Her fingers worked faster than the cold wanted them to. Near dusk, she tested it again. The flame caught. Smoke rose. This time it disappeared into the passage. Ruth waited. The fire strengthened. No smoke returned. She moved closer. A faint pull could be heard through the firebox, almost like someone breathing through a narrow crack. Ruth placed her palm against the outer stone. Nothing yet. She fed the fire another stick, then another. 20 minutes passed. The limestone began to change beneath her hand. Not hot, warm. Ruth kept her palm there. A small movement passed through her jaw. She quickly looked away from the heater, though there was nobody inside the cave to see her face. The first successful burn lasted only 40 minutes. She let it die before the clay became too hot. Then she sat beside the stone mass and waited. 1 hour later, warmth still came through the wall. 2 hours later, it remained. The proof was working, but the storm had not yet reached its worst. That became clear before midnight. Ruth woke to a sound like a freight train moving through the canyon. The buffalo hide curtain she had hung over the narrow opening snapped inward. Cold air spilled across the floor. Ruth jumped up and caught it. Snow had packed against the lower wall and was forcing itself through every unfinished seam. She pushed a timber brace across the doorway and drove stones against the bottom of the hide. The wind struck again. The entire entrance shuddered. Ruth stood with both hands on the brace. The wall held. She waded through another gust, then another. The third came harder than the first 2. Dust dropped from the cave ceiling. Ruth looked upward. A small crack ran across the limestone above her sleeping place. She had noticed it earlier. Now snow dust sifted from it. Ruth moved the blanket away. A chunk of rock the size of a plate fell seconds later and shattered where her head had been. She stared at the broken pieces. Then she dragged her bedroll beside the heater. The storm had found another way to test the shelter. Morning never truly arrived. The cave simply became less dark. Ruth fired the heater again. This burn was hotter. She fed 6 pounds of split wood into the box and allowed the flames to race. Within an hour, the outer stone had become warm enough that she could sit beside it without her coat. Outside, the temperature kept falling. Ruth hung a tin cup of water near the entrance. Within 20 minutes, a skin of ice formed across the top. She moved the same cup beside the heater. The ice disappeared. That simple difference told her more than any thermometer could have. She ate dried beans and half a piece of hard bread. Then she counted the wood. 3 days. Perhaps 4. Ruth looked toward the entrance. The wind made travel impossible. She could not gather more. She would have to make the cave use less. She spent the morning hanging her spare wool skirt along the inner side of the stone wall. She packed dry grass into the deepest seams. She rolled her blanket during the day and used it to block the lowest draft. Every small leak she closed meant another piece of wood she would not have to burn. By afternoon, the room had changed. The heater gave slow warmth from one side. The earth and limestone held the rest. Ruth sat on the floor and listened. No roaring fire. No constant chopping. Only the low sound of wind beyond the wall. Then something else came through it. A horse. Ruth stood. At first she thought she had imagined it. Then came another sound. A man shouting. She pulled the hide aside. White filled the opening. Nothing could be seen beyond 20 feet. The voice came again. Closer. Ruth stepped outside and cupped both hands around her mouth. Here! A dark shape moved below the slope. Then another. 2 horses. 1 rider. The second horse carried someone bent across the saddle. Ruth recognized Elias Boone before he reached the wall. Ice covered his beard. He was half dragging a smaller figure through the snow. "My daughter," he shouted. The girl's boots scraped against the ground. She was bringing supper to the Northline shack when this hit. Ruth ran down the slope. Together they carried the girl inside. She looked no older than 16. Her coat was stiff with ice. Her lips had gone pale. Elias lowered her beside the heater. She was out there almost 3 hours. Ruth touched the girl's cheek, then her wrist. A pulse moved beneath the skin. Slow. Still there. Ruth looked at the woodpile, then at the storm outside, then at the young woman lying beside the heater she had barely finished building. The shelter was no longer being asked to keep 1 person alive. Now it had 3. Elias Boone's daughter did not wake when they pulled off her frozen boots. Her name was Clara. She was 17, narrow-shouldered, with red hair stuck wet against her forehead. Ice had hardened the bottom of her wool skirt. 1 glove was missing. Ruth cut the wet stocking from Clara's right foot. The skin beneath it looked pale and hard. Elias reached for the girl's ankle. Ruth caught his wrist. "Not yet. She needs heat. She needs it slowly." Elias looked toward the masonry heater. Ruth shook her head. "Too close, too fast, and we may do more harm." She wrapped Clara's feet in dry wool and placed her several feet from the warm stone. Then she covered her with Ruth's only blanket. Elias removed his buffalo coat and laid it over the girl. For the next hour, neither adult spoke much. Ruth heated water until it was warm enough to touch, but nowhere near boiling. She soaked cloth in it and placed the cloth beneath Clara's arms and along her sides. Elias watched every movement. "Where'd you learn this?" "My father worked stone crews." "That teaches you frozen feet?" "It teaches you to listen when older men explain why someone died." Clara's breathing slowly deepened. Then her fingers moved. Elias leaned forward. "Clara?" Her eyelids opened halfway. "Pa?" His shoulders dropped. "Yes." Clara looked around the cave. Her gaze stopped on Ruth. "Where are we?" "Somewhere warm," Elias said. Ruth looked toward the entrance. "For now." That last part mattered. The storm had sealed the canyon. Snow had climbed nearly 3 feet against the outer wall, and the pressure increased with every hour. Ruth could hear it shifting against the stones. The cave itself was holding. The entrance might not. Ruth walked to the wall and pressed both hands against the largest center stone. Solid. Then she checked the wooden brace across the door. It had begun to bend. Elias saw it too. That wasn't bent before. "No." He stood. "What do you need?" Ruth handed him the hatchet. "Cut that dead branch into 2 braces." He took it without another question. They worked while Clara rested. Elias wedged 1 timber diagonally from the packed earth floor to the door frame. Ruth set the second against the lower retaining wall. The next gust hit. The hide snapped. The braces held. Elias looked at them. "Your whole place built like this?" "Built for pressure." He ran a hand along the interior stone. "I spent 30 years believing a proper house started with logs." Ruth pushed dry grass into another draft seam. "A proper house starts with what the weather cannot easily take from you." The words stayed in the room for a moment. Then Clara began coughing. Elias was beside her instantly. The girl sat up slowly. Color had begun returning to her cheeks. "My horse?" Elias looked away. Clara understood. She lowered her eyes toward the blanket. Ruth placed a wooden cup in her hands. "Drink." Clara took a small mouthful. You built this? Ruth nodded. Clara looked toward the heater. By yourself? Yes. My mother couldn't build a shelf. Elias glanced at his daughter. Your mother could shoe a mule. Clara looked at him. She could? She simply preferred not to tell people. Something almost passed across Clara's face. Then another gust struck the wall. Dust dropped from one of the joints. Ruth stood. The storm was tightening. For anyone watching from a warm room, survival could look simple after the danger had passed. A fire burned, a blanket covered someone, a wall remained standing. Inside the storm, it was different. Every hour demanded another choice. Every choice used something that could not easily be replaced. Wood, food, strength, time. Ruth counted all four. Their food might last 6 days. The wood would not. With 3 bodies inside, the cave stayed slightly warmer, but Elias had brought nothing except what remained in his coat pockets. 2 biscuits. A strip of dried venison. 6 matches. Ruth added them to the shelf. Then she counted the wood again. 2.5 days at the present burn rate. Maybe 3 if she pushed the heater harder and allowed longer cooling periods. The wind outside showed no sign of breaking. By the second morning, snow had buried the entrance halfway up the hide. Elias helped Ruth dig from the inside. They moved snow through a narrow gap using a cooking pan. If they allowed the entrance to seal completely, fresh air would become the next problem. Ruth carved a small channel through the drift near the top of the wall. A thin blade of daylight entered. So did cold air. Elias began plugging it. Ruth stopped him. We need it. That hole's costing heat. Less than suffocation. He removed his hand. Ruth placed 2 fingers near the opening. Cold air poured inward. Good. Then she crouched beside the firebox. The draft had weakened. Snow might be clogging the chimney opening above the cliff. Ruth fed in a strip of dry bark. Smoke hesitated, then rolled back into the room. Elias coughed. Ruth killed the flame. Clara pushed herself upright. What happened? Ruth looked toward the stone ceiling. The chimney's closing. Elias followed her gaze. Can you clear it from here? No. Then I'll climb out. Ruth turned toward him. In this? If that chimney closes, the heater's finished. She said nothing, because he was right. Ruth tied rope around Elias's waist. She tied the other end around the largest interior brace. If you lose the trail, follow the rope. Elias pulled his buffalo coat tight. Clara stared at him. Pa. He crouched beside her. I'm going 20 feet up a rock face. You don't know that cliff. Elias looked at Ruth. She does. Ruth tightened the knot. I'll go. Elias shook his head. You built this place. If one of us disappears outside, it cannot be you. Ruth looked at him for several seconds. Then she handed him the hatchet. The chimney exits above the east side. Stay against the wall. Don't cross the open slope. He nodded. Ruth lifted the buffalo hide. Wind punched into the cave. Elias stepped through. The white swallowed him almost immediately. Ruth dropped the hide and wrapped both hands around the rope. For the first minute, it moved steadily. Then it stopped. Ruth waited. Nothing. She pulled once. No answer. Elias! The storm took his name. Clara tried to stand. Ruth pushed her gently back toward the heater. Then the rope jerked hard. Once, twice, and suddenly went slack. Ruth stared at the loose coil lying across the floor. The knot outside had come free. She grabbed her coat. Clara looked at her from the blanket. What are you doing? Ruth tied the remaining rope around her own waist. Bringing your father back. She lifted the hide. Beyond it there was no trail, no rider, no cliff. Only moving white. Ruth stepped into the white and disappeared 3 paces from the door. The rope tightened behind her. She kept one hand against the limestone wall and moved sideways, boots feeling for the packed ledge beneath the snow. Wind drove ice beneath her collar. Elias! Nothing. She moved farther. The rope dragged across the rock behind her. Then her boot struck something soft. Ruth dropped to one knee. A glove. Elias's. She grabbed it and looked uphill. A shallow mark crossed the snow where a body had slid. Ruth followed it. 10 feet higher, she found Elias wedged between 2 limestone shelves. His hat was gone. One hand still held the hatchet. The other was pressed against his left knee. "You hurt?" "Enough. Can you stand?" "I can complain standing up." "Then stand." Ruth got beneath his arm. He rose with a sharp breath through his teeth. Above them, the chimney opening was packed with snow. Elias pointed. "There." Ruth took the hatchet from him. She climbed the last few feet and struck at the packed drift. Once. Twice. A plug of snow dropped away. A thin stream of warm air rose from the opening. Then another gust nearly threw her sideways. Elias caught the back of her coat. "That's enough." Ruth looked at the cleared opening. It would draw. They started down. Every step took longer than the climb. By the time Ruth found the rope again, Elias was dragging his left leg. She wrapped it around her wrist and followed it through the storm. The buffalo hide appeared suddenly in front of them. Clara pulled it open. They fell inside together. Ruth dropped the hide and leaned against the wall. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then Clara crawled toward her father. "You said 20 feet." Elias looked at Ruth. Felt longer. Ruth checked his knee. Swollen. Not broken. She wrapped it tightly with a strip of cloth and pushed him toward the warm side of the heater. Then she lit the fire. This time the smoke rose cleanly. The flame strengthened. Warmth began moving into the stone again. Ruth sat beside the firebox. Her fingers shook badly enough that she had to hold the cup with both hands. And Clara noticed. She said nothing. She simply placed the blanket around Ruth's shoulders. The storm continued through that night. Then through the next morning. The 3 of them stopped measuring time by daylight. They measured it by fires. One burn, then another. Ruth stretched each load of wood farther than the one before it. She waited until the outer stone cooled beneath her palm before lighting the next fire. They ate small portions. They slept close to the masonry. Elias woke twice because of his knee. Clara woke whenever the wind struck the entrance hard enough to shake the timber brace. Ruth barely slept at all. Late on the 3rd day, the cave became strangely quiet. Ruth opened her eyes. No roar outside. No snow scratching against the hide. She stood and pulled the covering aside. Morning light poured through a narrow gap above the drift. Blue sky. Ruth stared at it. Then she grabbed the pan. The 3 of them dug for nearly an hour. When the opening finally cleared enough to crawl through, Elias went first. He stood outside on one good leg and looked across the basin. Snow lay everywhere. Fences had vanished. Only the tops of sagebrush showed in places. Clara climbed out behind him, then Ruth. The cold struck hard, but the wind was gone. Far across the basin, smoke rose from several chimneys. One did not. Ruth knew which cabin it belonged to. The Calder place. Elias followed her eyes. "That your old house?" "Yes." "No smoke." Ruth went back inside. She picked up the hatchet. Elias frowned. "Where are you going?" "To see if they're alive." Clara looked at her. "They put you out." Ruth pulled on her gloves. "That doesn't change the temperature." Elias said nothing after that. They took his stronger horse. The trip across the basin took nearly 2 hours because the drifts swallowed the trail. When they reached the Calder cabin, snow stood almost level with the lower windows. Ruth climbed down. No smoke came from the chimney. She pushed against the door. Blocked. Elias helped her shoulder it open. The smell inside told Ruth the fire had been dead for hours. Vernon sat on the floor beside the stove with his youngest boy wrapped against his chest. His wife and 2 daughters lay beneath quilts near the wall. Everyone was awake. Barely. Vernon looked at Ruth as though the storm had brought back someone he had buried. "Our wood ran out yesterday." Ruth glanced toward the empty box beside the stove. Chair legs had been cut apart for kindling. One kitchen stool was missing entirely. "How long since the last fire?" "Before midnight." Ruth touched the boy's hand. Cold, still flexible. She looked at Elias. Get them moving. Vernon stared at her. Where? Ruth pulled one of the quilts from the floor and wrapped it around his wife. My place. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. Ruth pointed toward the door. Move. They made 2 trips. By afternoon, 6 Calders sat inside the cave they had once expected Ruth to abandon within a day. Nobody mentioned it. There was no room for speeches. Ruth gave the children warm cornmeal. Elias fed the heater. Clara hung wet gloves near the stone. Vernon sat close to the wall and kept looking at the masonry as heat slowly returned to his hands. Near sunset, he finally stood. He walked toward Ruth. I don't know what to say. Ruth handed him a bucket. Creek hole needs clearing. He took it. That was all. For the next 4 days, the cave held 9 people. The heater never went cold. The youngest Calder boy began laughing again on the 2nd morning. Elias could stand without help by the 3rd. Clara learned how to judge the fire by the sound of the draft. Vernon hauled wood without being asked. When the road finally opened, people began arriving from across the basin. Some came because they had heard Ruth had sheltered the Boone family. Others came because they had heard the Calders were alive. Most came because they wanted to see the cave. Ruth let them in one at a time. They touched the warm stone. They studied the narrow entrance. They looked at the south-facing opening and the thick limestone walls. Then they asked questions. By March, Ruth had helped build 3 smaller masonry heaters. By April, there were 7. When spring finally reached the basin, Vernon brought Ruth the corrected land papers to the cave. He placed them on her table. The cabin is yours. Ruth looked at the paper, then at the sunlight entering through the stone doorway. No. Vernon blinked. You don't want it? Ruth folded the paper and pushed it back. I already have a house. That afternoon, Clara arrived carrying a notebook. She sat beside the heater, while Ruth showed her how to shape the first layer of a small firebox. Outside, snowmelt ran down the canyon in silver threads. Inside, Ruth placed Clara's hand against the warm stone. Feel where the heat stays. Clara nodded. Ruth handed her the trowel, and the girl began laying the next stone. If you enjoy stories of frontier survival, resilience, and forgotten practical wisdom, subscribe and like for more.